Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People, Nature, and Big Ideas. I'm Rhonda Lee Chapman, Equity and Belonging Director at the Trust for Public Land. I work at the very vibrant intersection of equity and inclusion in parks and open spaces. But there is one area of my work that has been lacking significant attention, and that is the voices, experiences, and advocacy of the disabled community, which is an incredibly diverse and incredibly active community in the outdoors. And it wasn't until today's guest wrote me an email that I realized the absence of disabled voices in many, if not most, of the conversations and policies and programs I've been involved in. So let me share a few bits of data. In 2021, the US Census Bureau estimated that about 13% of US citizens had a disability. And the CDC estimates that just over 1 in 4, or 27% of US citizens have a disability. And so either way you measure it, the number of folks in the US with a disability is large. And the numbers likely fall short because they rely on self-reporting. So in terms of today's podcast and what we'd like to talk about, conversations around inclusion and equity and advocacy in the outdoors, this conversation is long overdue. So to help us dig into this topic is the real catalyst for this dialogue, the woman who wrote me that email, TPL's very own Alyssa Morley. Thank you for joining me today, Alyssa.
Hi, Rhonda. I'm so excited to be here.
You had the opportunity to be one of the first people to listen to People, Nature, Big Ideas. And I would love it if you could share with the audience what prompted you to reach out to me with your reflections.
I don't exactly know what it was. I just had a feeling that I needed to reach out to you. I watched all of the episodes at this point. I've watched them all multiple times because I was involved with them even before they were launched. And I think what really struck me about all three of the first episodes I watched is that I saw bits of myself in each of them and bits of my experiences in each of them. And that's one of the reasons that I just felt like I needed to reach out to you and tell you a little bit about my experiences and why this podcast and what you've been doing with it so far really meant a lot to me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So today we are talking about the disabled community. And I think that a lot of people in the US have no idea how many people in the US live with a disability. And most people have one image of what it means to be disabled. And I'd like to know if you have found that to be the case in your lived experience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, but for the most part, I've seen that people think disabled people are only a small subset of the population, which you've just proven with the data that you cited that that's not really true. I think people assume disabled people, they just happen to be unfortunate and they're just involved in some kind of tragedy that, it's not likely to happen to them, so they don't need to think about it. I think there's just a real lack of knowledge about what disability is, what it can be, what it encompasses, the giant spectrum that is disability. It's more prevalent than people think. And there's so many different forms it can take. And I think that gets overlooked as well.
I wonder, Alyssa, for the folks who haven't had the opportunity to meet you or speak with you, do you identify as a disabled person?
I do, yes.
I think sometimes it's helpful for folks to have more context. So with that, I'd like to ask you that disconnect that you're talking about, how people's lack of understanding or their very limited views around who encompasses the disabled community. When we think about being an advocate for disabled people, or even advocating for your own needs to your day-to-day life, that disconnect that you're talking about, what does that mean? What does that look like?
I don't really think about it much in my day to day because it is what it is. It's my life. I notice it when I am out and about just doing things. I have to advocate for myself a lot, which becomes exhausting after a while. And, my access needs really change depending on the situation. I'm someone that's an ambulatory wheelchair user, which means I use a wheelchair, but I also use crutches to walk depending on the situation. So my needs are totally different depending on if I'm walking or if I'm sitting. That is complicated. And I think it's complicated too by the fact that when people see a wheelchair user, they assume that that person can't walk, which isn't always true. Or, when people see me on my crutches, maybe they assume that I am capable of different things than what I'm actually capable of when I'm walking. So it varies because my body changes depending on the mobility aid that I need to use in that situation. And that really informs how I approach situations. Is this something that it would be best for me to walk? Would it be best for me to use my wheelchair? I have to do all of that mental gymnastics every time I do anything, go anywhere. And it makes it very hard too in my day-to-day life to just be spontaneous. Because if I try to go somewhere new, it's like I don't know what I'm going to encounter. So that makes it difficult. Or if you're meeting up with friends and your friends are not used to your access needs, that's another complication, right? Because then it's like you start grappling with all of this internalized ableism of like, look at all this trouble that I'm causing my friends.
I have had my own philosophy that accessibility actually begins in the mind before a person even walks out the door. And that sounds like it's very true for you. What are the conditions and the circumstances that you're going to be going to, and all of the unknowns and the inability to be spontaneous the way your heart and mind might want you to.
Yeah.
So that really gives all of us an opportunity to really examine our perspectives around access and accessibility. And I think about it in terms of equity. Very often I see, particularly in environmental organizations, think that access is the only definition of equity, and that's actually not accurate at all. I'm curious about some pushback you might get when it comes to making changes that can be more useful to the disabled community. I'm curious if you have any stories that you can share about that.
Yeah, I think I could share so many stories. I think the initial response I typically get is, oh, I haven't thought about it. So, they haven't even gotten to that point. But if they do push back, it typically always comes back to money and resources, because it's going to cost money to make changes. Where does the money come from? The other pushback that I often get goes back to this idea that, well, disabled people, there aren't very many disabled people that are trying to use my business or access this park. And so, it's just not a priority. And it's like, well, how do you know? If it's not accessible, maybe they're not coming because they can't, or because they don't want to put themselves through that. So they're staying in and they're staying away. I think a lot of people expect the world to be open and available to them, and some people can't.
Ooh, that is hitting really close. Going by the numbers, 23% of businesses are really missing out on a whole client base.
Yeah.
And I think people overlook the economic power that the disabled community has. And so sometimes people can only really resonate with what's hitting them at their bottom line. Like, what is this economic cost? And I'm curious, when we think about this access to the outdoors and inclusion is good for all of us, we had talked previously about access to the outdoors, and you were sharing a story about a trip you took to LA recently, and you went to some beaches there. I'd love for you to share that story with others.
Yeah, that was a great moment for me. I've been to a lot of beaches in my life, but I've never been to Southern California beaches. And I have to say, just as a side note, Southern California was pretty accessible for me. It was very refreshing. But when I went to the beach there, I used a beach mat for the first time. Now, I had seen people talking about beach mats and using them online, showing what they are and how they work, but I had never used one for myself until that day. And what I loved so much about it is they've got this mat that allows you to access the beach. And I think initially you think about wheelchairs and people on crutches. Both of those are me, but everyone was using that beach mat who came on and off the beach at the same spot that I was at. And it was so meaningful for me to see hundreds of people that day throughout the time that I was there using that beach mat I didn't see anyone else like me who clearly had a physical disability. But, when you go to the beach, you're usually hauling chairs and your kid's stroller, and you've got your arms full of towels and food and everything else that you bring to the beach. And to see all of these people using that beach mat because it made it easier to get onto the beach for them. I mean, it just meant a lot to me because it was one of those moments where it's like people often want to say, like, why should we bother to put in these features that are going to cost money, that are going to be expensive and hard to get and whatever? But everyone can use them and everyone can benefit from them.
You mentioned that California was very accessible, and I'm wondering if you can give a few other examples of how it was different for you in terms of where you live now.
It was a lot more accessible for me. I mean, I certainly still ran into issues. I just noticed, I was in pretty big cities when I was there. So there's a lot of like public transport, and the sidewalks are really good quality and they're clear, and just things seem to be a lot better thought out. And, there's a lot of elevators everywhere. And I was able to, like, say, leave the hotel and just go on a jaunt around and see what's around without, having to struggle a whole lot. And that isn't something I'm used to, and still had some issues, but nothing that I couldn't figure out.
I love that. When it comes to the outdoors in particular, so the beach being a place, an example of the outdoors, are there other examples of multi-use accessibility features when it comes to accessing, let's say, trails, for example? I know recently, and maybe we'll get into this later if we have time, I was observing some posts on Instagram where there were individuals it was one individual who was testing out a trail in a wheelchair. And I didn't want to kind of cloud my vision for our conversation today, so I didn't finish watching it because I wanted to be able to have real-time examples and experiences in talking with you. So I'm curious about other kinds of examples of multi-use features.
Yeah, on trails specifically, one of the things I think about the most is like the substrate. Is it going to be smooth? Is it going to be relatively flat? Is it going to be wide enough for me? And if I'm walking, I can only walk a certain amount before I have to rest. And so is there going to be a spot for me to sit down and rest and get ready to keep going? But obviously everyone's needs are a little bit different. So it just becomes really hard to make things accessible. And I think specifically in terms of trails and places you can go outside, that is where it's really important to just have transparent information available about that trail or park. It's incredibly hard to find, if you're someone like me and you can't just show up somewhere and expect to be able to navigate it. It's really hard to try to do the research beforehand to try to find out, like, is this something that I'm going to be able to do? Because it's not out there.
Wow. So the communication piece is very vital. Again, going back to that accessibility before you even walk out the door, right? And also not having to do so much work in order to get the information. They say knowledge is power, yet sometimes we withhold information, and then therefore the power is not evenly distributed to our communities. And so I think that's a really important point.
The piece about like withholding information, a lot of times it goes right back to that. I never thought about it. They don't think about how they need to put information on the website. Yeah, I think people just assume like, well, it's got accessible parking, so it's accessible. And it's like, no.
This is a little bit of a sidebar, but it's resonating with what you've been sharing with us so far today. I was in Santa Fe with a fellowship group that I'm a part of, and in the philanthropy sector. And we were meeting we had some representatives from the LGBTQ plus community in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And one of the speakers that we had on our panel was an advocate for the trans community. And they said, if you don't have a trans person sitting at the beginning of your project, in other words, when you're developing the idea, when you're developing the program, if you don't have a trans person sitting at the table, that's where your transphobia begins. And that was something that really struck me, because I think about that and all the advocacy I've been doing around equity, which has mostly truly been around racial equity and economic equity. And as I mentioned at the top, not as much engagement, effort, or thought around the disabled community. So again, I have some work to do. I know that TPL recently ran an article about the work we were doing around trail accessibility, and I think it brought up some memories for you. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, it did. So admittedly, I'm a little bit biased toward the content that we post because I get to work with some of the geniuses who come up with our content and our strategy. When I read this article that outlined various TPL projects that feature accessible design, I felt really happy reading it because it made me think of how much things are changing. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot that still needs to change, but things have started to change. So the memories that it really brought up for me were from when I was a child. A lot of the times I couldn't play with the other kids on recess. I spent a lot of my time just staying in my classroom, either working on homework or bugging my teachers, whichever ones would, have a conversation with me, and just waiting for recess to be over because I couldn't necessarily go out and play on the playground the same way that all the other kids were doing. I remember there was like this brick wall that I would sit against a lot and just like watch the other kids. Part of it was just like the physical aspect of like I couldn't physically access things the same way that the other kids were doing. And part of it was also just, not a lot of the kids wanted to play with me and wanted to include me. So when I read this article, it just made me feel really hopeful that there are places now where kids can go and play and they don't have to have the same experiences that I did. But it makes me feel like, okay, something is happening. There's places that I can go. There's places that kids can go so that, they don't have to feel like that kid sitting inside or sitting up against the wall.
Thank you. That is, it gives me a bit of a visceral reaction in my gut when I hear and have images of you sitting up against the wall, just watching everybody. And it brings me also to something that you shared when we were talking previously. I think it was a couple of weeks ago or so. And you said that the ability to do the things, whether it's walking, moving, seeing, talking, hearing, even tasting, it's just a matter of time until our ability becomes severely limited. You said
Mhm.
ability is temporary. Anyone can be disabled at any moment. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
I'm a young person and I have the perspective of a young person. I surround myself with a lot of other young people, but it strikes me as really short sighted. You could become injured or get into some accident or something at any time that could lead to a disability, or you could have, some cognitive thing that happens, who knows. But the unique nature of disability is it's one of the only communities that you can just become a part of anytime, any day, at any point in your life. And even if you make it through your whole life without anything like that happening to you and never being affected by it, if you get to a point where you are old enough, your physical abilities and your cognitive abilities are going to start declining. So it strikes me as just really short-sighted when people think like, oh, that's not something I have to worry about because it doesn't affect me. Well, at some point in your life, if you're lucky enough to get there, it will.
30 years ago, so now I get to date myself a little bit, but I'm proud. It's okay. 30 years ago, to your point about having being fortunate enough to live enough life, I was in a pretty horrifying car accident, and I was ejected from the car and smashed my head open and got other parts of my body mangled, and ended up being in a natural coma and then a medically induced coma. And as I'm, resting, so to speak, everybody else has to hear these stories about how I wasn't going to be able to walk and how I was going to be losing the vision in one side of one eye, my left eye in particular, all kinds of horrible prognoses, right? Based on the textbooks of like what happens when this kind of brain damage occurs and this type of injury. And none of those things happened. I regained full mobility, I regained full sight, and all of those kinds of things. But it was an 8-month journey to get back to being able to be fully mobile, being able to do things like touch my nose on command and things along those lines. So when you talk about the temporary nature of our ability, it's very true. And I don't know that I ever took it for granted, but I did up until that point. It just strikes me as essential that people with disabilities do need to be brought into conversations around how we can be planning our communities to be as accessible as possible. And I think this kind of goes back to my comment about what I heard from the leader last week in Santa Fe. If we are not bringing accessibility into our project designs at the very beginning and incorporating the voices of advocates and or disabled people, we really aren't being as inclusive as we desire. I also know from a very practical level, the more inclusive you are, the more efficient you can be as well. You don't have to work backwards. You don't have to repair the thing that you overlooked. So, as we think about the curb cut effect is a very powerful metaphor for equity. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, you put a curb cut into a sidewalk and everyone starts using it, or you put an automatic door on a building, everyone starts using it. It's this perfect way of illustrating that if we just bake that into the design to begin with, we don't have to go back and change it later, fix it later. It's just there. And, if we involve disabled people, because everyone's got a different perspective. I have mine based on my experience, but there's plenty of people who can speak on things that I don't know much about. If we involve them in the conversations and in the design to begin with, we don't have to make assumptions and then have to go back and fix things later, or just never fix things and leave a bunch of people out.
Amen. It all comes back to the idea that inclusivity benefits everyone. It does no harm, frankly.
Wow.
For years, we have heard folks say things about systems being broken when some of us argue that systems are not broken at all, that they actually are performing exactly the way they were designed. And that's, from my perspective, where all of the isms exist, whether it's racism, ableism, sexism, it all stems from how these systems were designed from the beginning. So when we think about how our infrastructure is designed, I think we can agree that they're primarily focused on people who have full mobility and full sensory ability. And I know that trip that you shared about when you went to the beach in LA, you also ran into an issue with an airline, and it brought up this part about infrastructure.
Yeah, traveling presents a unique set of challenges as a disabled person. I do think it's getting better, but on my flight to California, my wheelchair was broken because it had to be underneath the plane with all the luggage. When I get there and I realize it's broken, I have to go and talk to the person at the gate who can then point me to this customer service representative that I have to go talk to about how I can get this fixed. They told me that it was going to be fixed during my trip. They were going to come to my hotel and fix my wheelchair. Of course, that didn't happen. It actually took a total of 5 weeks. By the time I got home, I then had to involve a third company. It's just like, that's the way it's designed, because they want to pack as many people as possible on that plane. They don't want to create a space for people to keep their wheelchairs on board. The infrastructure is made in such a way that they're hoping you'll be too afraid of anything happening to your mobility aid and you won't even go on vacation and they won't have to deal with you.
There was something that you said when we were chatting, and you said, am I actually disabled, or is it the systems that we've created that are disabling me? And I just want folks to sit with that for just a moment. Are you the one who's actually disabled, or is it the systems that we've created that are disabling you? And that is so deep and so profound. And I really thank you for even bringing that question into my mindset, because I think that we can apply it to this particular topic, this scenario, this reality, this lived experience, I think there's a combination of ignorance and awkwardness and fear that swirls around when it comes to our willingness or even our competence to talk about and tackle the issues that we've been discussing. And I know that I see people interact with people with disabilities, and it can be really offensive. And I've seen situations where, person A sees person B, I'll say you, I see you in a wheelchair and I start talking to you slowly, or I start talking to you very loud. And it's just wild how ignorant we can be. And I know it's not our intention, but the impacts can really cut deep. And so when we're thinking about ignorance, when I'm thinking of ignorance, you recently educated me about the term handicapped. And I will say, in full disclosure, I am also learning to remove language from my vocabulary almost on a daily basis. So can you tell me and the listeners about where the term handicap came from?
Yeah, I think language is tricky, right? Because it changes all the time. The things that we deem acceptable change all the time. So the term handicapped is very highly debated in the disabled community as to whether it goes back to a time when beggars were begging for money with their caps in their hands, or does it relate to sports like a game of golf or horse racing where you give the superior competitor a handicap to even out the competition? Either way, no matter how you look at it, it's offensive because you're inherently ranking, a superior person and an inferior person. So, I personally, you'll hear me talk about myself as disabled because that's how I choose to refer to myself and my community. That's a term that's really been reclaimed by disabled people. But there's a lot that I personally don't say anymore, but I find they're very pervasive still in our vocabulary. A perfect example that I don't use, but I hear used all the time is like special needs. That's inherently othering because that means that I have special needs and everyone else has other needs. The other one that comes up a lot in this conversation is euphemisms that people have created to talk about disability in ways that makes them feel more comfortable. So people will refer to me sometimes as differently abled, handy capable. For me, it's like, just call it what it is, stop tiptoeing around it. That's just increasing the stigma and the discomfort around it. Just call it what it is.
That's real. That is so real. And oh my goodness, we need to do a whole nother episode on just calling it what it is. That might be something that's coming up. We're coming to, I guess, the end of our allotted time. And I want to bring the conversation back to the purpose of this podcast, which is people and nature and big ideas, right? You just gave us one already. Call it what it is. So when it comes to access to nature and facilitating some nature-based experiences for people, for and with people with disabilities, where do you think we are? And you started to say you think things are changing. You have a little bit more hope in some of the new practices that you've been observing. But I'm wondering where there are places where you think we can have a much bigger impact. And as I'm asking you this, I also want to pause and say, I fully realize, based on my lived experience as a Black woman born in America, very often groups or individuals who have been made marginalized, those of us who have been othered, somehow the onus is on us to figure out the solutions. And so as I'm asking you this question about where are we and what should we do, I do want to invite you to share some big ideas that you might have, or even small ideas that are so obvious that it just makes us all want to smack ourselves in the forehead.
I do think it's gotten better, just anecdotally, things that I've experienced throughout my life. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, has only been around for as long as I've been around. It's really not that old, and I think people are surprised to learn that. I think it has done some good work in that, places now have to do certain things to be compliant. But what people don't realize about the ADA and the regulations that are in place is that's really the basement, not the ceiling.
Mm.
There's so much more we can do and should do. And I will say, like, I've noticed a lot of differences when I think back to when I was a kid. Things are better now, but there's just so much more that could be done. And I think what it really takes is just a collective effort, right? And it takes, baking those things in, those ideas in from day one before you even start designing a project or a park, a trail, and where we can have a big impact. I think now in the age of the internet is just share this information far and wide. If it is an outdoor space or even really anywhere that disabled people might access, I encourage people to think about how can I share information about this to let people know if it's suitable for them, if they can access it. And I mean, my dream reality at some point in the future would be a world where I don't even have to think about it before I leave the house. Like, am I going to be able to do this or go here, or what is it going to bring down on me and my friends or my family or whoever happens to be with me, right? Like, it's just, there's a lot of mental and emotional labor involved there that I think could just be eliminated if I could just go through the world like everyone else.
Sometimes it's, I think we over intellectualize and complicate things unnecessarily when they can be so basic. I think they say that everything that you need to know about how to live in life, you learned when you were in second grade. I wonder if you have some readings or other resources related to some of the things that we've talked about today that we could share with folks. We know, because as we mentioned already, that the onus tends to be on the folks who have been othered to do the education, to do the informing. And what I think I've learned, and you probably have too, is like, you know what? A, there's Google. B, here's some other books. Here's some folks to follow. Here's some places that you can go to do your own learning. So I'm curious if you've got some resources that you would feel comfortable sharing for folks to learn how to be better, to take the onus off of our othered disabled community, and to also open up their point of view and have a much broader perspective that's more inclusive and equitable.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's another huge question that I could think on for a long time. But I guess like some accounts that I follow, one that I think is critical to the discussion of this podcast is Disabled Hikers on Instagram. I think they're doing fantastic work in the Pacific Northwest, putting information out there about trails so that people know if it's something they might be able to do. I think there's another account called Unlikely Hikers that's similar, but they show, just different types of people doing things in the outdoors, because I think people often have a very specific image in their head of what an outdoorsy person looks like and what an outdoorsy person does and what they wear and who they are. And I love Unlikely Hikers because it shows a variety of different people outside enjoying the benefits and joys of the outdoors, like we always talk about here at TPL. Like it's not just that image that you have in your head. I love those in particular. I also follow quite a few people who talk a lot about traveling with a disability, and a lot of that happens to be outdoors.
As we're talking about accessibility and we're talking about nature and the outdoor spaces, one of the things that you shared, Alyssa, was that sometimes just sitting in front of the window and looking outside and taking in all that nature has to offer, whether it's the trees or the birds or what other kind of animals or just the view. Sometimes it can be a sunset, sometimes it can be a sunrise. Even being able to just look outside and access nature in that way counts. It's for our mental health and our well-being. It can have a very calming, soothing effect on us, on our nervous systems, as we are working very hard every day and we need to take a break. So I wanted to thank you for that, for bringing that additional point of view, that sometimes it's just the ability to safely look outside your window and have nature right in front of you for you to experience its benefits. So I really want to thank you for that.
I think that's something that I've been reminding myself of even more since I joined TPL, because I'm working at a place where, most people around me are generally pretty outdoorsy people, and they go and do these amazing things. And it's easy to start to feel a little bit sad that, there's no way I could do that, right? Like, so I'm just sitting on my back porch, like listening to the birds or looking out the window. But it's not a competition, we can all enjoy the benefits and joys of the outdoors. And there are things that I probably will always wish I could do, but I can also be grateful that I have a big, beautiful window in front of me that I can look out of, or I can sit on my back porch and listen to nature or stand in the rain or whatever it might be. I've been reminding myself of that a lot now that I'm working in an environment where like so many people around me are very physically active and very outdoorsy. It's hard sometimes. But I'm a big reader, and I recently read a book that had a quote in there that stopped me in it. I actually went back and physically read it like 3 times because I was like, wow, just profound. And I've been reminding myself of that whenever I feel, some of that internalized ableism coming up and where I start to feel less than. And it said, how similar does someone have to be to you before you remember to see them first as human? And it reminds me when I start to feel like I don't belong here, or, I don't belong in a park, or I don't belong at TPL. I'm human and you're human and we're all human. My experience is just a little bit different.
I think that's where we end it. That was absolutely beautiful. Cheers to our humanity, and cheers to our expanding our points of view, and cheers to encouraging all of us to think a little bit differently and to apply a little bit differently. Doesn't always do much good when it's just sitting in your head. So here's to your humanity. I'm so grateful for you and your time, and I know everybody else will be too. Have a good day.
Thanks, Rhonda.